right, get ready because today we're diving into something pretty unexpected. It's the rising number of people converting to Christianity in Iran and other Muslim-majority countries. And honestly, I was kind of blown away by some of the stories and the stats I found while I was researching for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that makes you question a lot of assumptions. We think about places like Iran and we picture this strong Islamic tradition. So to see this kind of shift happening is pretty thought-provoking.
For sure. So the thing that kind of got us started on this whole deep dive is this YouTube video. It's called Iran Shocked as 1 Million Muslims Convert to Christianity, Jesus Revolution. It's from a channel called The Savior. Now, I know a title like that sounds a little, over the top, but I think we should just put aside any preconceived ideas and really dig into what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming into this with an open mind is key because what we're talking about is a really personal decision. And we need to understand what's motivating people to make that choice.
Exactly. So let's start with this claim that 1 million Muslims in Iran have converted to Christianity. I mean, that's a huge number. And the video really emphasizes that point. They even talk about how mosque attendance is going down and show pictures of these churches that are just packed. But is this trend actually statistically significant? Like, what data supports this claim?
Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. You see, getting reliable data about religious conversion in a place like Iran is really difficult. The government there, they have tight control over religion, and they're definitely not publishing stats on people leaving Islam. So we kind of have to rely on personal stories and reports from groups like CBN and this international radio ministry called The Tide, which can be helpful, but it's often hard to verify independently.
So it's more of a qualitative picture than a quantitative one. We get the sense that something's happening, but we can't be sure of the exact scale. But even so, the video does point out a bunch of reasons why people might be turning to Christianity, and some of them are actually pretty relatable.
Yeah, one of the big themes that comes up over and over is this disillusionment with Iran's government and the whole theocracy. People are struggling with corruption, the economy, lack of personal freedoms. They're looking for something to give them hope in a system that feels broken.
Right, and the video actually quotes this senior Iranian cleric, Mohammed Abul Qasim. He's admitting that fewer people are going to mosques, and he sees that as a crisis of faith. I mean, that's a pretty big statement coming from a religious leader.
It really suggests that this feeling of dissatisfaction goes beyond just politics, It's about a deeper need for something more, a need for that spiritual connection that a lot of people feel is missing. And that's where the message of Christianity, with all its talk about love, forgiveness, and a personal relationship with God, starts to really appeal to them.
There's this one quote from the video that stuck with me. Someone said they found freedom in Christ. It's like Christianity represents this escape from the restrictions they feel under the current regime. It's not even just about religious beliefs. It's about wanting a totally different way of life.
And we can't forget that for a lot of converts in Iran, this choice comes with some serious risk. They could be persecuted, imprisoned, or even face violence from their own families or communities. This isn't a decision they're making lightly.
Yeah, that's a heavy thought. And the video doesn't shy away from showing those risks. They have footage of underground churches being raided, and they talk about how badly converts can be treated in prison. It really makes you think about the courage it takes to make a change like that.
Definitely. But despite all that danger, people are still converting. It shows just how strong their convictions are, how powerful that message is that's drawing them in.
The video also talks about how family and friends react, and it's actually more complex than you might think. Obviously, some families are completely against it, but others are surprisingly accepting. It's almost like they're thinking, well, if this makes you happy, then who am I to judge?
Yeah, it reminds us that even families and communities that seem really uniform from the outside, they often have a lot of diversity of thought and belief going on within them. And sometimes seeing someone find happiness in a different faith can spark curiosity and understanding instead of just condemnation.
It's definitely more complicated than we might assume. But before we go any further, I think it's important to say that these personal stories, as powerful as they are, they're just one small piece of a much bigger picture.
Right. We've been talking a lot about Iran, but the video suggests this trend is happening in other Muslim-majority countries too, places like Afghanistan, Yemen. even Saudi Arabia.
Whoa, Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's where Islam started. What's going on there?
Well, according to the video, even in a country known for its really strict interpretation of Islam, there are signs that more people are open to Christianity, at least from what we see from the leadership. They quote Todd Nettleton from Voice of the Martyrs. He says that while there are still challenges, there's a growing sense that peaceful coexistence with Christians is becoming more of a possibility.
That's a pretty big change from even a decade or two ago. Makes you wonder if this is part of a bigger trend in the region. Or maybe even something bigger happening globally.
It's a question worth exploring, and one that we'll be digging into deeper as we continue this deep dive. Some even said they could hear him talking to them, giving them messages of hope and forgiveness. And a lot of times, these experiences were so intense and so real that people couldn't just ignore them. They felt like they had to figure out what it all meant.
So it's not necessarily about rejecting Islam completely. It's more about finding something that fills a void, that sense of spiritual connection that might have been missing. And for a lot of people, they find that in Christianity.
Exactly. That message of love, forgiveness, and having a personal relationship with God really resonates with them, especially when they might be feeling disillusioned or oppressed. It gives them a different way of looking at faith, one that's less focused on strict rules and more about personal experience and change.
And it seems like these personal experiences are often what lead them to connect with other Christians, sometimes through these underground churches or online platforms. It's almost like a modern-day search for belonging, but it's all driven by faith.
Yeah, absolutely. The video talks about how converts are using technology to find each other, to share their stories, and to build a community. It's a pretty cool example of how people are adapting and finding ways to connect, even when they're facing potential danger and persecution.
It really shows how important human connection is, that need to belong, especially when you're going through such a major life change. But we spent a lot of time talking about Iran. What about these other countries the video mentions, like Afghanistan, Yemen, or Saudi Arabia? What stood out to you about those situations?
Well, each country has its own unique situation, of course, but there are some common themes, like in Afghanistan, for example. The situation for Christians is really dangerous now that the Taliban is back in control. They face a ton of risks, and they often have to practice their faith in secret.
It's hard to imagine the kind of risks they're taking just to worship and connect with God in the way they choose.
Yeah, the video quotes someone from the Tide Ministry, and they say that in Afghanistan, accepting Christ comes with a very real threat of death. It's a stark reminder of how dangerous it can be for converts in certain parts of the world.
And yet, even in such a hostile environment, the video suggests that Christianity is still spreading. It makes you wonder, what is it about this faith that keeps drawing people in, even when the cost is so high?
Well, I think for a lot of people, that message of hope and redemption that Christianity offers, it's a powerful way to cope with the despair and uncertainty they face in their everyday lives. It gives them strength, comfort, and meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable, and that resonates with people no matter what their circumstances are.
The video also talked about Yemen, where Christianity is supposedly spreading almost twice as fast as the global average. That's amazing, especially considering the war and the humanitarian crisis that's happening there.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it shows how deeply humans need hope and spiritual comfort, even in the middle of incredible suffering. We often see a surge in faith during times of crisis, and Yemen is a really powerful example of that.
And then there's Saudi Arabia, a country that, for a lot of people, represents the very heart of Islam. But even there, we're seeing some signs of change.
Right. The video acknowledges that there are still challenges, but it seems like there's a growing understanding, at least among the leadership, that peaceful coexistence with Christians is actually possible.
It's a subtle change, but a significant one. Do you think it's a sign of things to come or just an isolated example?
It's tough to say for sure. It could be a sign of bigger changes happening within Saudi society. Maybe it's because of globalization and the need to be more open to a diverse world. Or maybe it's a strategic move by the leaders to make Saudi Arabia look more moderate on the world stage. Whatever the reason, it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's really interesting to see how these global trends are interacting with local contexts and how they're shaping the religious landscape in ways we might not expect. But I'm curious, how is this story being told outside of this specific video? Has this whole surge in conversions, especially from Islam to Christianity, been covered in other places?
It's definitely been making some noise, especially online. The video mentions this viral tweet by Demenda, who's a conservative commentator. He claimed that millions of Muslims are converting to Christianity. And that sparked a lot of debate, some of it well-informed and some of it not so much.
It's a good reminder that not everything we see online is accurate, and we have to be careful about the information we're taking in.
Exactly. Social media can be great for spreading awareness, but it can also easily spread misinformation and sensationalism. We have to make sure we're checking our sources, considering different perspectives, and approaching these kinds of claims with a healthy dose of skepticism. Just because something goes viral doesn't mean it's true.
You're absolutely right. We need to be critical thinkers, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like religion. But the fact that this is sparking so much discussion online and offline, it shows that it's hitting a nerve. This is something people are thinking about and debating. It's clearly more than just a small fringe thing.
Definitely. And I think it brings up some really important questions about the future of religion, especially in a world that's becoming more interconnected and diverse. Are we seeing a fundamental shift in the religious landscape? Or is this just a temporary reaction to specific events? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure. But that's part of what makes this topic so interesting. We're watching something unfold right in front of us. And it's hard to say where it's all going to lead. But one thing's for sure, the conversation about faith, identity, and belonging is more important now than ever.
I totally agree. And as we continue this deep dive, I think it's a good time to step back and think about what we've learned so far.
Yeah, I agree. We've covered a lot of ground, from the political and social stuff driving conversions to the personal stories of people who have made that choice, the risks they face, and what it all means for the future of religion in the Middle East and beyond. It's been a fascinating look into this topic for sure. But I always like to try and tie things together. So what does all this mean in the bigger picture? What are the main takeaways you hope listeners walk away with from this deep dive?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that faith and religion, they're not static. They're always changing. They're shaped by so many things: social stuff, political stuff, economic stuff, and personal stuff. And this whole thing with people converting to Christianity, especially in places where Islam is the dominant religion, it's a perfect example of how dynamic religion can be.
It definitely makes you rethink a lot of assumptions. We tend to think of religious identity as something fixed, but this shows us that it's much more fluid. It's a way more personal experience than we might realize.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to acknowledge the courage and resilience of these people who choose to convert, especially when they're facing real risks and opposition from their families and communities. Their stories show us that faith is a deeply personal thing, and that search for meaning and connection, it transcends cultural boundaries.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitical side of things or just the numbers, but ultimately this is about individual people and the choices they make because they believe in something.
Yeah, and their stories highlight how powerful belief can be. It can have a profound impact on someone's life, even when they're facing huge challenges.
I think another important takeaway, especially nowadays, is how important it is to be media literate. We talked about how this whole narrative of mass conversions is playing out on social media, with everyone making all these claims and counterclaims. It's a good reminder that we can't just passively absorb information, especially when we're dealing with complex and sensitive topics like religion.
Yeah, you're right. We have to be smart about the information we consume. Especially now with social media where things can go viral so quickly, it's crucial to check our sources, to look at different perspectives, and to be a little skeptical of these big, sweeping narratives. Just because something blows up online doesn't mean it's true.
Exactly. We have to think critically about what we see and hear and be willing to question things. But even with all that said, the fact that this is generating so much discussion online and offline, it shows that it's really resonating with people. It's tapping into this sense of change that's happening in the world of faith.
I agree. And I think this deep dive leaves us with more questions than answers. Like, is this a lasting shift in how people view religion, or is it just a temporary response to specific events? It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah, I guess that's part of what makes this so interesting. We're seeing something happen right now. And it's hard to predict where it'll all go. But one thing's clear. The conversation about faith, identity, and belonging is more important than ever.
Absolutely. And if our listeners want to explore this more, I'd recommend checking out Fred Mukaria News on YouTube. They have some great analysis of what's going on in the Middle East, including how religion and politics are connected.
Great suggestion. They give a lot of context for understanding how complex that region is. And for everyone listening, as you dig deeper into this, here's something to think about. What do you think is driving this increase in conversions from Islam to Christianity? Is it mainly about faith? Or is it tied to bigger social and political things going on? There's no easy answer, but it's something worth thinking about.
It is. And the more we have these kinds of conversations, the better we'll be able to understand the complexities of a world where faith, culture, and identity are always evolving.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.